As with most of ancient Britain, Honley's ancient history is still somewhat undetermined, but due to multiple finds in the 19th century of antique remains, historians and archaeologists have proved that ancient Britons lived in the area over 2,000 years ago. The first mention of Honley comes with the Domesday Book of 1086. Honley was owned by two Saxon thanes, or free-necked men, named Cola and Suen. The Saxon thane generally varied in position, but in the book it is written that the area was waste. It could reference the destruction wrought by William, but also may convey a different meaning. The moorlands of Honley were at this time the most inaccessible and desolate in the entire of Britain. Referencing the destruction wrought by William, William had tried to subjugate the north of England, and it is said that because the north was so resistant to this subjugation, that he had to finally burn everything with fire and destroy with sword all who stood in his way. Contemporary biographers of William the Conqueror considered this to be his cruelest act and a stain upon his very soul. Writing about the harrying of the North, as it was called, over 50 years later, the Anglo-Norman chronicler Orderic Vitalis wrote about it here. The king stopped at nothing to hunt his enemies. He cut down many people and destroyed homes and land. Nowhere else had he shown such cruelty. This made a real change. To his shame, William made no effort to control his fury, punishing the innocent with the guilty. He ordered that crops and herds, tools and food be burned to ashes. More than 100,000 people perished of starvation. I have often praised William in this book, but I can say nothing good about this brutal slaughter. God will punish him. Cola, one of the Saxon thanes, was never heard from again and is presumed to have died fighting. We do know that due to the merciless nature of William in exacting his absolute rule, it can be assumed that he had all of his titles revoked despite his resistance. Suen was the son of Alric, the owner of Pontefract Castle, who was also deprived of his possessions in favour of Ilbert de Lacy. Though Suen does not disappear like Cola, as his descendants can be traced all the way to the time of Charles I, where they held estates in other parts of Yorkshire. Much of what this documentary reveals about Honley is in large part thanks to the works of a lady named Mary Ann Jagger. She was the well-known author of A History of Honley published over 100 years ago. According to Mary, the residents of Honley in her time commonly recalled the good old days. In her words, many old people think now that England has seen her best days on account of the introduction of such evils as reform bills, railways, penny post, and cheap printing, preferring instead the blessings of ignorance and restricted travel. She also talks of how modern architecture has complete disregard for the surroundings of the village, and how once the beautiful landscape has slightly been tainted by the image of progress, smoke, large industrial buildings, and working class housing being built. Ironically, Mary's own house was in violation of building regulations, as it used regular red brick, which completely contrasted with the rest of the houses on her road, which used standard issue Yorkshire stone. According to the Honley Civic Society, the house was demolished in the 1990s. For the sake of time, we must now move on to the First World War. What caused it, why it was so unique, and how it affected the people of Honley. When war broke out in Europe 1914, to the average person it must have seemed completely and utterly confusing. A complex set of alliances, an assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne at the hands of a state-backed group of Serbian terrorists, the balance of power in Europe, the naval arms race, and national rivalry all culminated in what would become the bloodiest war in Europe's history. Over 9 million combatants and 7 million civilians died as a result of the war, including the victims of several genocides, a casualty rate that was greatly worsened by the belligerents' technological and industrial sophistication, and a tactical stalemate caused by grueling trench warfare. The war was so severe that its effects on the German people would sow the seeds for the rise of Nazism and the Second World War only 20 years later. The lead up to war is impossibly complex, and to do it justice requires a documentary in itself, but a quick overview of the war is as follows. In 1882, to keep their best interests intact, Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy formed the Triple Alliance after France had been competing with them for territory in North Africa and beyond. Similarly, the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894 and the Entente Cordiale of 1904 tied Russia, Great Britain and France into an alliance against the other powers in Europe. The Anglo-German naval arms race of 1898 led to worsened relations between Britain and Germany and only served to heighten rivalry and tension. A series of crises in Morocco, Bosnia and the Balkans also served to destabilise Europe and add fuel to an already burning ember of war. Trigger, however, was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie at the hands of terrorists, backed by the Serbian state. The political objective of said assassination to break off Austria-Hungary's South Slav provinces so they could be combined into Yugoslavia. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia, which it partially rejected, and was punished therefore with an invasion, and the complex alliance system came into play, and with Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium, Britain was thrust into a war that would last 4 years. At the time, it was referred to as the Great War, as nobody could have predicted in 1914 that such an atrocity could occur again between the European powers in the form of the Second World War in 1939. When war began, the British only had a small, largely urban English volunteer force of about 400,000 soldiers, almost half of whom were stationed overseas to garrison the British Empire. The term British Expeditionary Force is often used to refer only to the forces present in France prior to the end of the First Battle of Ypres on the 22nd of November 1914. By the end of this year, the old regular army had been wiped out, though despite its small size, it had managed to help stop the German advance. As the regular army's strength declined, Field Marshal Kitchener began to raise new divisions. In the early stages of the war, the initial call for 100,000 volunteers was far exceeded. Almost 500,000 men enlisted in 2 months, and around 250,000 underage boys also volunteered. The appeal of Powell's battalions, the effective propaganda depicting German barbarities, and the naivety of young men all contributed to the substantial turnout. Honley was one of many communities that sent a large number of its young men overseas to fight for Great Britain. The purpose of this next section is to highlight the people of Honley and the way that they fared during the years of 1914 to 1918. Many Honley men signed up together in the early stages of the war, and casualties were light to begin with. Only one name on the village war memorial comes from 1914, and just 2 more in 1915. In 1916, however, numbers began to rise. This is mostly due to the fact that volunteer soldiers were ready for service around the time of the Somme. The Battle of the Somme, described by the BBC as 141 days of horror, was the bloodiest battle fought on the Western Front. Fought between the 1st of July 1916 and the 18th of November 1916, more than 3 million men fought in this battle and 1 million were killed or wounded. With 57 to 60,000 British men dying on the first day alone, it is no wonder that 20 men named on the War Memorial died in 1916, followed by 25 in 1917, and 30 in 1918. Honley was not only generous in the form of men to fight, but also in the form of relief to Belgium. The Honley Belgian Relief Fund helped shelter, feed, clothe, and employ Belgian refugees in the area. After the great battles of 1916 onwards, there was great pressure on hospitals as the wounded returned home from the front. After 2 years of tending a few soldiers who returned home from France with lesser injuries, the villagers of Honley felt that something more needed to be done. A delegation from the local hospital committee in Honley, consisting of Margaret Sykes and Hilda Smales, requested on the 8th of October 1916 that Moorbottom Congregational Church, now Trinity Church, Honley, permit the loan of premises as a hospital for wounded soldiers. The Sunday school building at Moorbottom was proposed for conversion, initially with 26 beds. A public meeting was held in Honley on October 15, 1916. Before the meeting closed, £381 had been subscribed, and Miss Emily Frances Siddon was appointed president of the hospital committee. The hospital was ready for opening just 18 days after the meeting. The opening on November 1st was performed by Lieutenant Colonel Harold Hollich, son-in-law of William Brooke of Northgate Mount, Honley. He said that in the Huddersfield district there was difficulty finding 500 beds in 1915, but by the opening of the Honley Auxiliary Hospital, 1,060 beds were available in the locality for the wounded. The following day, all 26 beds at Honley were occupied. The Honley Hospital treated 601 wounded or sick soldiers before closing.
The servicemen often preferred the auxiliary hospitals to military hospitals because they were not so strict. Also, auxiliary hospitals were less crowded and the surroundings were more homely. A familiar face appears frequently in Honley throughout the war. Samuel Jagger, husband of Mary and a local councillor, fought for better pensions for many women in the village. He was the secretary of the Honley Local War Pensions Committee. With so many young men fighting on the Western Front, a number of special constables were recruited to keep the peace in both Honley and Melton. Samuel was one of these men. Stories of bravery were common throughout the war, and these are some of the stories of Honley men who courageously gave their lives for their country in this conflict. Some of these stories come from the works of Peter Marshall and his book, Honley in the Great War, 1914 to 1918, a most detailed book on the topic. Fred and Willie Newsom were the sons of George and Annie Newsom of Honley. Both Fred and his younger brother Willie worked in the woolen industry. Their father had died aged 50 in February of 1916, leaving their mother Annie to cope with the tremendous stress of raising a large family and the thought of her sons being conscripted when it was introduced a month later on March 3rd. According to Peter Marshall and my own findings, Willie was killed by a gunshot to the head on the 16th of September during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. Significant tactical advances were made during this battle, as the Germans suffered over 130,000 casualties of their own and came face to face with the British tanks for the first time of the war. Due to the sacrifice and bravery of men like Willie, the German Empire came closer to military collapse than it had ever been before autumn 1918. Concerned that he had not heard from his brother, Fred and the 13th King's Royal Rifles advanced in atrocious weather conditions on the afternoon of October 12. As part of the Battle of Anchor Heights, where the Royal Rifles saw much of their action in the war, Fred and his fellow soldier, Lance Corporal Gilbert Weston, were hit by a blast from a nearby rifle grenade. Both of them lost their lives and were laid to rest by Reverend Ernest W. Trevor. Sadly, the Reverend lost his life just 4 weeks after the funeral. Annie had lost 2 sons within a few weeks of one another. Her grief is hard to imagine. Willie Lindley, a friend of Willie Newsom who lived in the Brights buildings at Nailey, was killed in action in late November 1917. As Peter Marshall highlights, the sheer number of brothers from Honley that died in the war is both saddening and shocking. Archie and Willie Munro, who lived in Magdale, were both killed in October and July 1916. Ben and Colin Hanson, sons of Sergeant George Hanson, also lost their lives. In March 1916 and on the 3rd of May 1917, though Colin's body was never found. Henry Parkin lost his life in October 1916 and his brother Albert in May 2 years later. Harold and Lewis Hinchcliffe from Cross Street were killed in 1917. Online, you can find the recordings of a Lockwood-born man named Lewis Cocking. Son of a brass finisher, he went out to war in 1915, but by 1918 was a prisoner of war. He married and settled in Honley after the First World War, and in 1967, for the first time after Christmas dinner, he revealed his experiences of joining up. If anything, Mr. Cocking's experience goes to show that even the men who came home found the war incredibly difficult to talk about, and it is for this reason that much of the First World War's ground-level stories are still shrouded in mystery, even today. Private Arthur Carnby, the youngest son of the late Mr. and Mrs. Chas Carnby, who resided with his sister, Mrs. J. Fawcett, was killed in action on the 20th of November whilst serving with the regiment with which so many young men from Honley are actually associated. A Dean House lad who went out at the same time as Arthur was also injured. He said that they had just got over the top when enemy snipers opened fire, and it was there that Arthur got hit. He was respected by his superiors and fellow men alike, as he had served in France for almost a year straight. He was a distinguished member of the Honley Cricket Club, and like so many of the men mentioned in this list, worked in Dean House Mills. News reached Mrs. Crossland of Fiston Road, Honley, around the 18th of March 1916, that her son had been killed in action. He was gallantly leading a bombing party when it happened. Corporal G.W. Crossland was a respected member of William Brooks' Bible class at Honley Parish Church School. His brother-in-law, Private Baskerville, lost one of his legs through wounds as well. Holmfirth Express wrote about the devotion of Private Hurst, who gave his life for king and country before he had even reached his 20th year. He was a local lad who was reported missing on September 3rd, 1916. Though inquiries were made, they were met with zero success, and now his name is added to the list of those who are now missing or dead in the war. The son of Mrs. Hurst, 55 Station Road, Brookholes. He was a quiet boy who loved his home, but felt devotion to serve his country in its time of need, like so many of the lads from Honley. He was well known in the district, where he worked for Messrs. Robinson's smithy place. He was also attached to Brockholes Wesleyan Chapel. Ex-Police Sergeant Fred Wood of Honley was informed that his only son, Private Frederick Douglas Wood of the West Riding Regiment, was killed in action on July 31st. His friends, Private George Smith, Walker Milnes, C. Marsden, George Ingle, and A. Hall, had written to the parents expressing their sympathy. Private Wood was a capable young man who was carrying a bag of bombs to the front line when he was killed by a piece of shell. A former member of the Honley Parish Church, he had been serving for over a year. This was written in the Holmfirth Express on the 12th of August, 1916. Within Honley itself, there were several organisations aside from the auxiliary hospital that helped with the war effort. The Volunteer Training Force, though not recognised by the War Office, was an entirely financially self-supporting militia whose members had genuine reasons for not joining the army in 1914. There was a drum and bugle band, which was made up of local young men, most of them too young to serve in the military. Similarly, there were women in Honley that served in the Voluntary Aid Detachment, the most well-known of which being Ellen Holdroyd, where she served in the Honley Auxiliary Hospital. The VAD was a voluntary unit of civilians providing nursing care for military personnel in the United Kingdom and various other countries in the British Empire. Nurses worked in both field hospitals and even close to the battlefield. When peace came around, approximately 100 men from Honley and the close surrounding area had been declared KIA or MIA during the war. This includes all the names on the War Memorial and even some whose names were not found on the War Memorial. It is hard to imagine the emotion at the end of the war, considering how pointless it proved to be. Though geographically and politically much changed, it's clear that very few lessons were learned from the first of the World Wars. Peace Day in Honley was a day of jubilation for many, as no more blood would be shed. But as the figure of 100 dead suggests, very few families were untouched by the war throughout the village. This led to a feeling of mixed emotions throughout the village, despite exuberant celebrations. It was not uncommon to erect memorials in communities and cities up and down the country to commemorate their fallen. There is various in my city of Manchester, and Honley was no exception. When I went to visit, I called attention to the fact that the memorial is far away from the centre of the village, instead being found at the entrance to the cemetery at Greencliff and near the Mag Brook. An obelisk of white granite, it serves as a reminder to our generation and the generations that should follow of the horrors of the war and the bravery of the young men that went out to face it. Lest we forget. In the summer of 2019, Honley Civic Society and Honley Community Centre will be participating in the village celebrations of Peace Day 1919, where both Honley and the rest of the nation celebrated the end of the war and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. This documentary was written by myself, Alexander Dale Makin, with the assistance from my friend and colleague Harry Pearce, as a small and short video tribute to the people who served both on the front line and the home front of the First World War. This humble documentary does no justice to give you a full scope of what the men and women of Honley went through, and there are plenty of stories that in this time frame I simply could not cover. My small contribution to Honley Remembers 2019 hopefully gives you a brief but insightful view into Honley in the First World War. I could not have done this without the help of several key people. Peter Marshall, Honley historian and author, has done so much to help me, both through his works and help through correspondence. The works of both him and the rest of the Honley Civic Society have been crucial to this entire documentary, and without them, it would not exist. I highly recommend the book Honley in the Great War, and the rest of their works for a more thorough read on Honley's deeply fascinating history. Cyril Ford, though I have never had the pleasure of meeting him, had meticulously documented every single Honley lad who had gone off to fight, those who came back, and those who didn't. Without his incredible research, this documentary would have taken years. Huddersfield Examiner and Holmfirth Express have also wrote many stories about Honley in the past 100 years, including about the Auxiliary Hospital, the Newsom brothers, and so much more. All of this was integral to my research and I thank them so much. I must also give great thanks to both Carol and Dennis Roberts, who got me involved in the project in the first place, and like Peter, have helped me so much in organising the entire project and giving all their assistance with the documentary. Without them, this wouldn't have come to fruition. Furthermore, I must thank the Huddersfield Library, the Honley Library, the Huddersfield Archives, the Huddersfield University Archives, the University History Department, Leeds Archives, Kirklees Image Archive, British Pathé, and every other institution whose contribution to history has allowed me to create this documentary. And of course to Mary Jagger. Her book, though 100 years old, is one of extremely few about Honley's pre-war history. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed making it.